The wind swept across the wide plains, carrying with it the smell of dust, dry grass, and horses. Ethan Cole stood on the porch of his sprawling but weather-worn ranch house, his calloused hands gripping the rail. At 35, Ethan was still, considered a young man, but his face bore the weight of years spent under the sun and the solitude of an unforgiving land. Deep lines carved his forehead, and his gray-blue eyes seemed older than his years, as though every drought, every failed crop, and every long winter had etched itself into him. His ranch was one of the largest in the valley, sprawling over hundreds of acres with cattle scattered like moving shadows on the horizon. The work was endless, mending fences, branding cattle, breaking wild horses, but Ethan had never complained. Hard work was something he knew how to handle. What he didn't know how to handle anymore was the emptiness that filled the silence once the work was done. Ethan had tried for years to ignore it. After all, he wasn't a man given to sentimentality. His life was built on discipline and grit, not feelings. But lately, the silence in his home gnawed at him. The long dining table in his ranch house stood unused, a relic of a family he no longer had. His parents were long gone, and though he had once courted a girl in his 20s, she had chosen another man, a banker in town who could promise an easier life than a rancher could give. Ethan never faulted her for it, but the rejection had quietly closed him off. Since then, he had poured every ounce of himself into the ranch, thinking perhaps success and land would be enough. Yet, the nights told him otherwise. He found himself sitting by the fire, staring at the flames, wishing for the sound of another voice. The ranch hands came and went, loyal but transient. They drank their whiskey, played their cards, and moved on when the next opportunity arose. None of them stayed, and none of them filled the hole Ethan carried inside. It was one evening at the local saloon when Ethan first overheard talk of mail-order brides. A group of men gathered around a table laughed about it. Women from the East, widows or spinsters, who paid to come west in hopes of marrying a man they had never met. The idea struck Ethan as both strange and sensible. Strange because the thought of binding yourself to someone you'd never laid eyes on went against the practical nature of his upbringing. Sensible because he knew the odds of finding a wife in a town where men outnumbered women 5-1 were slim at best. The idea lingered in his mind for weeks. He wrestled with it as he worked the fields and rode the range. At first, he dismissed it, telling himself it was desperation disguised as practicality. But when winter came and the ranch was snowbound, he felt the walls of his loneliness press closer than ever. He realized then that what he wanted wasn't just a housekeeper or a companion for social appearances. He wanted someone to share the burden of life with, someone to laugh with, to talk to at the end of a hard day, maybe even to start a family with before time slipped away completely. Finally, Ethan sat at his desk late one night, oil lamp casting shadows on the rough wood, and put pen to paper. The letter he wrote was plain-spoken, much like the man himself. He explained his ranch, his age, his financial stability, and his desire for a wife who was strong enough to endure the hardships of frontier life. He did not embellish his words with poetry or flattery. He wasn't that kind of man. He simply offered the truth and hoped somewhere a woman might see it as enough. When he sealed the envelope and placed it in the outgoing post, Ethan felt both foolish and strangely hopeful. He had faced rustlers, droughts, and stampedes, but this step felt like the greatest risk of all. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to wonder, what if this letter was the beginning of something more? The whistle of the train echoed. Through the valley, a long, mournful cry that sent horses skittering in their corrals and drew a handful of townsfolk toward the depot. Trains didn't come often to the small frontier town of Dry Creek, and when they did, it was always an event. Merchants expected shipments of goods, ranchers anticipated supplies, and sometimes, though less often, new faces stepped down onto the platform, carrying with them the scent of faraway cities and stories from a world much larger than this rugged patch of land. Ethan Cole was among those who stood at the station that day, though he kept to the shadows cast by the overhang, his wide-brimmed hat pulled low. He wasn't a man who liked to be the subject of gossip, and yet he knew whispers would soon circle the town. Everyone had heard by now, Ethan Cole, the solitary rancher, had sent for a wife. The thought of it seemed to amuse some and intrigue others. The train hissed to a stop, releasing clouds of steam that curled in the air. One by one, passengers descended, their boots and shoes clattering on the wooden platform. There were businessmen in stiff suits, weary mothers with children clinging to their skirts, and young men chasing fortune in the West. And then, at last, there she was, Clara. Clara stepped down with a small leather trunk in her hand, her gloved fingers tightening on the handle as she steadied herself. She wore a simple traveling dress of faded blue, neat but not extravagant, and a bonnet that shielded her face from the midday sun. When she lifted her chin, Ethan caught his first clear glimpse of her. She wasn't a beauty in the way most men judged beauty. Her features were soft and plain, her cheeks a little too pale from eastern winters, and her eyes wide with the uncertainty of a woman who had left everything behind. Yet there was something in her posture, a quiet dignity, that suggested she was stronger than she looked. Ethan's stomach tightened. This was the woman who had answered his letter. This was the woman he was meant to marry. He had imagined her differently, though he couldn't have said how. Maybe livelier, maybe prettier, maybe more. His disappointment was swift, unkind, and he hated himself for feeling it. Clara, for her part, searched the crowd until her gaze landed on him. A flicker of relief crossed her face. She recognized him from the description he had included in his letter. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a weather-beaten look only years of ranch work could carve. She took a step toward him, clutching her trunk as if it were the last anchor to her past. "Mr. Cole?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. Ethan tipped his hat, forcing a polite smile. "Miss Clara," he said. For a moment, they simply regarded each other. Around them, the station bustled with movement and chatter, but it felt as though the world had gone strangely still. Clara, with all her courage, had traveled hundreds of miles to be here, and Ethan, though he had longed for this moment, found himself unable to hide the disappointment that stirred within him. The townsfolk noticed, too. A few women whispered behind gloved hands. One man chuckled under his breath, nudging his friend. Clara pretended not to hear, though the flush that crept up her neck betrayed her awareness. Ethan cleared his throat. "I'll fetch the wagon," he said curtly, his tone polite but distant. "We'll see you settled." Clara nodded, though her heart sank. She had dreamed of this moment on the long train ride west, the meeting of her future husband, a man who had seemed so honest and steadfast in his letters. She had hoped for a smile, a word of comfort, some sign of welcome. Instead, she was met with reserve, almost coldness. As Ethan loaded her trunk into the wagon, Clara climbed onto the wooden seat beside him. The horses stamped impatiently, eager to be moving, and Ethan gave the reins a sharp flick. The wagon rolled forward, carrying them out of town and into the wide, open stretch of prairie. Clara sat quietly, folding her hands in her lap. She told herself she would not be discouraged. She had chosen this path, and she would make the best of it. But in her heart, a small, unwelcome fear took root. What if Ethan Cole regretted ever sending that letter? The wagon wheels rattled across the rough dirt road, carrying Ethan and Clara away from the bustle of town. The silence between them grew heavier with each mile, broken only by the creak of the harness and the steady thud of the horses' hooves. Clara sat with her back straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, while Ethan kept his eyes fixed on the horizon, his jaw clenched. She wanted to speak, to ask about the ranch, about his life, about what their days might look like. But something in his stiff demeanor warned her against it. He had been polite enough at the station, but his voice carried no warmth. The image of the man she had constructed from his letters, a man of quiet strength and open honesty, did not seem to match the man beside her now. When at last the ranch house came into view, Clara's breath caught. It was larger than she had expected. 2 stories of weathered timber with a wide porch overlooking endless acres of pasture land. Barns and corrals stood nearby, and cattle grazed in the distance, their low calls carrying on the breeze. It was a place that spoke of hard work and endurance. For a fleeting moment, Clara allowed herself a spark of hope. Perhaps this place could become home. Perhaps Ethan's reserve would soften once she settled in. But the moment the wagon halted, Ethan spoke in a tone that dashed her hopes. "Miss Clara," he began, his voice low and deliberate. "I need to be plain with you." Clara turned to him, her hands still folded tightly, her heart quickening. "Yes, Mr. Cole." He removed his hat, running a hand through his hair before fixing his gaze on the ground. "When I wrote that letter, I thought I knew what I wanted. A wife, a partner, someone to share the work and the quiet. But seeing you here, it's clear I was mistaken." The words landed like stones. Clara blinked, unsure she had heard him correctly. "Mistaken?" she whispered. Ethan's jaw tightened. "You seem a good woman. I don't doubt your courage in coming all this way. But you're not what I expected, and it wouldn't be right for either of us to force something that doesn't fit." Clara's throat burned. She had endured whispers from strangers, the grueling days of travel, and the wrenching pain of leaving behind everything familiar. All of it, for this moment, only to be dismissed like an afterthought. She felt the sting of humiliation rising, hot in her cheeks. "I see," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "You've judged me before you've given me a chance." Ethan winced at her words but didn't waver. "It's better to be honest now than to let this fester. I'll see to it that you're given lodging in town until you decide what to do next. The boarding house will take you in." Clara turned her face away, blinking back tears. She would not let him see her cry. If he thought her weak, she would not confirm it. "Very well," she said, each word clipped with restraint. Ethan replaced his hat and climbed down from the wagon, unloading her trunk with a grunt. Clara followed, her steps measured, her back rigid. The ranch loomed behind them, vast and imposing. But already it felt like a place she would never belong. He loaded her things back into the wagon and, true to his word, drove her back toward town. Neither spoke. Clara stared at the landscape rushing past, her mind spinning. Every mile carried her farther from the life she had imagined and deeper into the unknown. When the wagon finally pulled up outside the Dry Creek boarding house, Ethan set her trunk on the dusty street. He hesitated, his mouth opening as though to say something more. But in the end, he only tipped his hat. "I'm sorry, Miss Clara," he said quietly. Clara lifted her chin. "Don't be. I'll manage." And with that, she picked up her trunk and stepped through the boarding house doors, her heart shattered but her resolve hardening with every breath. She had been rejected, cast aside before she'd had the chance to prove herself. But as the door closed behind her, Clara vowed that this would not be the end of her story. The boarding house smelled faintly of boiled cabbage and coal smoke, a far cry from the polished parlor Clara had once imagined as her new home. Mrs. Whitaker, the rough or stout widow who ran the place, greeted her with a mix of curiosity and pity. Dry Creek was not a town where secrets stayed hidden for long, and Clara suspected her story had already begun to make its rounds. "Rooms small but clean," Mrs. Whitaker said briskly as she led Clara upstairs, skirts swishing against the faded carpet. "You'll share the washroom with the other boarders, and supper's at 6 sharp. That trunk all you got?" Clara nodded, her gloved hands tightening on the handle. "Yes, ma'am." The woman studied her for a moment, eyes narrowing with something that might have been sympathy. "You'll do fine," she said finally, and left her alone in the modest little room. Clara set her trunk by the bed and sat down, her hands trembling at last, now that she was away from Ethan's cool dismissal. The room was quiet except for the ticking of a clock in the hallway. She allowed the tears to come then, hot and unrelenting, spilling down her cheeks as she buried her face in her hands. She had given up everything for this, her small life back. East, the security of her father's house, even the promise of a familiar church and neighbors who knew her name. She had traded it all for hope, for the chance to build something new. And in the span of one wagon ride, that hope had been crushed. But Clara was not a woman who yielded easily to despair. Her tears subsided, replaced by a slow, steady resolve. If Ethan Cole thought she was not strong enough, she would show him, and the entire town, that she could not only endure but thrive. She had traveled too far to slink back home in shame, greeted by whispers and pitying glances. Returning east would mean defeat. Staying meant hardship, yes, but it also meant possibility. By the next morning, Clara was dressed and downstairs, before most of the other boarders stirred. Mrs. Whitaker raised her brows at the sight of her neat hair and determined expression. "Don't suppose you're the sort to sit idle," Mrs. Whitaker remarked, pouring coffee into a chipped mug. "No, ma'am," Clara said, her voice firm. "I'd like to find work, if there's any to be had." Dry Creek was no city. Opportunities were scarce, especially for a woman alone. Still, Clara asked at the general store, the dressmaker's shop, and even the saloon. She was turned away more often than not, but her persistence impressed a few. By the week's end, she had secured small tasks, helping Mrs. Whitaker with meals, mending clothes for neighbors, and minding children for mothers who needed to fetch supplies. The pay was meager, but it kept her occupied and, more importantly, earned her a place in the town. Yet whispers followed her wherever she went. Some called her the poor girl who got left on the platform. Others speculated whether Ethan had sent her away because she wasn't pretty enough or strong enough or simply not the woman he'd hoped for. Clara heard the gossip but refused to let it weaken her. Each insult only fueled her determination. One evening, as she walked back to the boarding house with her sewing basket in hand, she paused outside the saloon. Laughter and music spilled through the swinging doors. Through the haze of smoke and lamplight, she glimpsed Ethan inside, standing at the bar, his broad shoulders unmistakable. He looked just as solitary as he had that day at the station, glass in hand, gaze distant. Clara's heart twisted, but she lifted her chin and walked past without a word. He had made his choice. Now, she would make hers. That night, as she sat by the window in her little room, Clara whispered aloud to the darkness, "I will stay. I will make a life here, with or without Ethan Cole." And with those words, the course of her future shifted. Spring in Dry Creek came grudgingly. The snow melted into mud, the wind carried dust instead of frost, and the prairie grass fought its way through hard, dry earth. For Clara, the change of season brought no easing of her own struggles. Life in town was harsh, and though she had resolved to stay, resolve alone did not fill her stomach or pay her bills. The sewing work she had taken on barely covered her rent at Mrs. Whitaker's boarding house. Some weeks she earned a few extra coins by mending a ranch hand's shirt or darning stockings for the blacksmith's children. Other weeks she earned nothing at all. She learned to make a little bread stretch, to patch her own dresses until the fabric itself seemed more stitches than cloth. Pride kept her from asking for help, though she sometimes lay awake at night, listening to her stomach growl. The whispers never stopped. Women at the mercantile cast sideways glances when she walked in, and more than one man chuckled as she passed, murmuring something about Ethan Cole's cast off. Clara kept her head high, but inside, each careless word cut. She had not come all this way to be the subject of ridicule, yet she could not escape it. One morning, as she carried laundry to the riverbank to scrub, she overheard two ranch hands talking. "Shame, ain't it?" one said. "She come all this way just to be sent packing?" The other laughed. "Can't say I blame Cole. Man like him deserves better. She's plain as bread dough." Clara's hands tightened on the basket handle. She walked past without a word, but the sting of their laughter burned in her ears. By the time she reached the river, her eyes were hot with tears. She set down the basket, drew a deep breath, and forced herself to focus on the work. If she cried every time someone doubted her, she would never survive. But hardships were not only made of cruel words. The West was unforgiving. That spring, a late frost killed half the gardens in town, and Clara's small patch of vegetables behind the boarding house withered overnight. Food grew scarce, and prices at the general store climbed higher. Clara had to take on washing for the saloon, a task that left her hands raw from scrubbing whiskey stains out of linen. Then came the sickness. A fever swept through Dry Creek, sparing no family. Children coughed in the night, mothers fell too weak to cook, and strong men were laid low in their beds. Clara could have kept to herself, but something inside her refused. She remembered her mother's remedies, poultices of mustard and vinegar, teas brewed from willow bark, and she went from house to house offering what help she could. She sat with frightened children, cooled fevered brows, and prayed silently for strength when her own body trembled with exhaustion. By the time the fever passed, Clara was gaunt and weary, but her quiet courage had not gone unnoticed. Neighbors, who had once whispered, now spoke her name with respect. Mrs. Whitaker praised her openly. Even the skeptical storekeeper offered her a sack of flour at half the price. Still, the hardest battle was the one inside her. Every evening, when she sat aside her needle and thread, she felt the loneliness press close. She had not come west merely to survive. She had come in hope of love, of building a life with Ethan Cole. And though she told herself she no longer cared what he thought, she could not banish the image of him from her mind. His steady eyes, his quiet strength, the man she had glimpsed in his letters but not yet in life. Yet, Clara refused to let despair claim her. The West had tested her, and though she bore its marks, she remained standing. She told herself again and again that survival was the first victory. Proving herself, showing Ethan, the town, and even herself that she belonged, would be the next. Summer settled heavy over Dry Creek, the kind that baked the earth until it cracked and sent shimmering waves across the horizon. For Clara, the heat was not her greatest burden. It was the endless proving. Every day, every task, every moment, she felt she was being weighed and measured by a town that still half expected her to pack her trunk and leave. But Clara did not leave. At first, her contributions seemed small. She kept to her mending and laundry, took in odd jobs where she could, and stretched every coin until it squealed. Yet she found ways to give more than what was asked. When Mrs. Whitaker grew too weary to rise before dawn, Clara slipped quietly into the kitchen to start the coffee and biscuits. When one of the blacksmith's daughters brought her a ripped pinafore, Clara returned it the next day not only patched but trimmed with a neat row of stitches that made the child beam. Word spread quickly. "That Miss Clara," folks began to say. "She's got a steady hand and a kind heart." Her greatest gift, however, proved to be her ability with children. Many of the families in Dry Creek were too busy with ranching or shopkeeping to properly school their little ones. Clara, who had once helped her father teach at the church back east, began gathering children on the boarding house porch in the afternoons. With chalk and a battered slate, she taught them their letters, read from a tattered Bible, and spun simple arithmetic into games. The children adored her, and their parents, grateful for a few hours' reprieve, began to see her. Not as a cast-off, but as a blessing. It was during one of these lessons that Ethan Cole happened to ride through town. He had come to pick up supplies and paused when he heard laughter spilling from the boarding house steps. There was Clara, her bonnet pushed back, her face alight with animation as she held up the slate. Children crowded around her, eager and smiling, hanging on her every word. Ethan's chest tightened. He had dismissed her as meek, unsuited for the harshness of frontier life, yet here she was, stronger, brighter, more alive than he had ever seen her. He did not speak to her that day. Instead, he rode on, troubled by the image that lingered in his mind long after. Meanwhile, Clara's reputation grew. When the storekeeper's wife fell ill again, Clara was the first to arrive at her bedside with broth and clean linens. When a traveling preacher came through town and found his Bible in tatters, Clara stitched the cover herself. And when a widow lost her husband to a ranch accident, Clara organized the townsfolk to deliver food and tend to the children. She did these things quietly, not seeking praise, but the town noticed. Where once she had been whispered about as the rejected bride, she was now spoken of with admiration. "You ask me," one man muttered in the saloon. "Cole was a fool to turn her away." Clara heard such remarks now and then, though she tried not to let them stir her heart. She had promised herself not to care what Ethan Cole thought. Yet some evenings, as she set aside her sewing and gazed out at the wide, golden prairie, she could not help but wonder if he had noticed the change. The truth was, he had. But Ethan was not a man to speak easily of his thoughts, and Clara was not a woman to chase where she was not wanted. And so for now she continued her quiet work, proving herself not just to him, but to the whole of Dry Creek. Her place in the West was no longer in question. She had carved it out with her own hands. The ranch had always been Ethan Cole's pride. It was the one thing in his life that had never abandoned him, never faltered, never judged. But as summer dragged on, even the land seemed to turn against him. The heat scorched the prairie grass until it crumbled beneath the hooves of his cattle. Water holes dried to mud, forcing him to drive the herd farther each day in search of pasture. Fences gave way under pressure from restless steers, and rustlers, always lurking at the edges of honest men's toil, grew bolder, slipping through the night to cut brands and steal stock. Ethan's hands, tough as rawhide, blistered as he worked from dawn until well past dusk. He rode out alone to mend fences, stood guard with a rifle through moonless nights, and pressed every ounce of his strength into holding the ranch together. His men did what they could, but they were drifters at heart, men who took their wages and moved on when the going got too hard. And when one by one they began to drift away, Ethan was left with only a skeleton crew. The solitude that had once been his armor now weighed like a stone on his back. Long, silent suppers by the cold hearth filled him with a gnawing emptiness. He tried to ignore it, burying himself in work, but loneliness seeped into his bones. He would catch himself staring out across the barren fields, thinking of the woman he had dismissed, the woman who had come all this way only to be turned aside by his narrow vision of what he thought he wanted. Clara. Her name lingered on his tongue, though he never spoke it aloud. He saw her sometimes in town when he came for supplies, always busy with some task, her expression set with quiet determination. The children gathered around her like bees to a blossom, their laughter filling the dusty street. The sight unsettled him. He had misjudged her. He knew that now. Yet pride bound his tongue. What could he say? That he had been wrong? That he had been too blind to see her strength? One evening, as Ethan sat in his dimly lit kitchen, the loneliness broke over him like a storm. He had been nursing a glass of whiskey, staring into the amber liquid as though it held answers. The house creaked in the summer heat, empty of voices, empty of laughter. For the first time, he admitted the truth to himself. The ranch might be his life's work, but without someone to share it with, It was nothing more than a burden. The next morning brought no relief. As Ethan rode out to check a far pasture, a storm rolled in from the west. Thunder cracked across the sky, and lightning split the air. The cattle panicked, their hooves thundering like war drums as they bolted in every direction. Ethan spurred his horse, shouting, waving his hat, fighting to turn the herd. But in the chaos, his horse stumbled on uneven ground, and Ethan was thrown hard to the earth. Pain shot through his leg as the storm raged around him, and for the first time in years, fear seized him. Not of death, but of what would happen if he failed. The ranch was on the edge of ruin, and Ethan knew he could not hold it together alone. He had been wrong to think solitude was strength, and though he would not yet speak it aloud, a thought pressed unshakably at the back of his mind. Perhaps the woman he had rejected was the very one who might have stood beside him through all this. The storm broke hard over Dry Creek, a fury of rain and wind that turned the dust into rivers of mud and sent shutters banging against walls. Townsfolk huddled inside, praying roofs would hold. Out on the open prairie, the storm was far more dangerous. And Ethan Cole lay sprawled in it, his horse gone, his leg twisted at an angle that told him he wouldn't be walking on it any time soon. Lightning split the sky, followed by the stampede of cattle crashing through the storm, their fear greater than his shouts. Ethan clenched his jaw and dragged himself across the sodden ground toward a lone cottonwood. He managed to haul himself, upright against the trunk, breath coming in ragged bursts. Every muscle screamed, but worse than the pain was the knowledge gnawing at him. He couldn't manage the herd, couldn't protect the ranch. Not like this Dot by morning. Word had spread in town that Ethan Cole was down. A rider had found him and brought him back, battered and feverish, his legs swollen and useless. When Clara heard the news, she froze mid-stitch at the boarding-house table. Her heart thudded painfully. She had promised herself she was finished caring what Ethan thought of her, finished longing for what he had denied her. And yet, the thought of him alone in that big, empty house sent a pull through her she could not ignore. That afternoon, she walked to his ranch, Dot. The place looked worse than she remembered. Fences sagged where cattle had broken through and tools lay abandoned in the mud. The air smelled of damp earth and livestock. She hesitated at the porch steps, smoothing her worn skirt before knocking firmly. A ranch hand answered, his expression frazzled. "Miss Clara, what brings you out here?" "I came to help," she said simply. Dot inside, comma. Ethan lay on a narrow bed near the hearth, his face pale beneath a week's worth of beard. His eyes flickered open at the sound of her step. For a moment, neither spoke. Then his lips parted. "Clara," he rasped Dot. She set her basket on the table with a determined thump. "You need tending, Mr. Cole, and by the look of this place, your ranch needs it even more." Ethan's pride bristled. "I can manage," he muttered. She met his gaze steadily, her voice calm but unyielding. "You can't even stand. Let me do what you will not admit you need." Something in her tone silenced him. He leaned back against the pillows, defeated more by his own weariness than by her words. Clara worked without hesitation. She bathed his fevered brow, cleaned the gash on his arm, and bound his leg with clean strips of cloth. She organized the few hands still on the ranch, directing them to mend fences, gather scattered cattle, and bring order back to the chaos. She cooked hearty meals from the sparse stores in the kitchen, her hands moving with a competence that brooked no argument. For days she kept at it, moving through the ranch house and pastures as though she had always belonged there. Ethan watched from his sickbed, torn between shame and admiration. She was everything he had thought she wasn't. Capable, steadfast, unflinching in the face of hardship. One evening, as the storm's wreckage slowly gave way to calm, Ethan found his voice. "I misjudged you, Clara." His words were rough, stripped of pride. "I thought you weren't enough for this life. But you've done more in a week than I could have asked of any partner." Clara paused, her hand resting on the back of a chair. Her heart leapt at his confession, but she steadied herself. "It's not about being enough for you, Ethan Cole. It's about being enough for myself. And I am." Her words struck him harder than the fall from his horse. He realized then that she was not just proving herself to him, but to everyone, including herself. And in that moment, Ethan saw the truth. Clara wasn't the one who had fallen short. He was. By late summer, the storm's wreckage had faded into memory, but the change it brought to Ethan Cole's ranch and to Ethan himself was lasting. With Clara's guidance, the cattle were rounded up, the fences rebuilt, and order restored. More than once, neighbors came to lend a hand, and each time they saw Clara at the heart of the work, sleeves rolled, voice steady, directing with the authority of someone who had long since earned her place. The townsfolk began to speak differently of her. Where once she had been that poor girl Cole sent away, now they said, "Clara's the one keeping his ranch standing." The whispers of pity had turned to admiration, even awe. At church, women who had once kept their distance now invited her to sit beside them. Children ran to her after services, tugging at her skirt with stories and laughter. Men nodded respectfully as she passed. Ethan noticed it all from the sidelines. At first, he had burned with shame, knowing it was his pride that had cast her into hardship. But the more he watched her move through the town, the more he felt pride of a different kind. The kind that swelled when a man realized he was in the presence of someone extraordinary. His leg healed slowly. Clara insisted he rest, though rest was never in his nature. More often than not, he found himself in the rocker by the hearth, his gaze following her as she moved about the house. Sometimes, when she caught him staring, he would look away, ashamed of what he had once denied her. One evening, when the day's work was done and the ranch hands had gone to their quarters, Ethan called her name. "Clara," he said softly. She turned, a lamp in her hands, her face bathed in warm light. "Yes?" He hesitated, his throat dry. Words were not easy for him, especially the ones that mattered. "I owe you more than thanks. I owe you an apology." Clara set the lamp down carefully. "For what?" "For judging you before I knew you," he admitted. His voice was rough, but the honesty in it was clear. "For thinking you weren't strong enough, for sending you away when I should have welcomed you. I was blind, and I've been a fool." Clara studied him, her expression unreadable. Part of her wanted to accept the words and let the ache in her heart finally ease. But another part remembered the long nights at the boarding house, the hunger, the whispers, the way she had been made to prove herself when he had never given her the chance. "I don't need your apology, Ethan Cole," she said at last, her voice steady. "I've built a life here without your approval. I've earned respect on my own. What you think of me doesn't decide my worth." Her words stung, but Ethan nodded. "You're right. It doesn't. But I hope you'll let me prove that I see you now for who you are, for the woman I was too foolish to recognize before." Silence hung between them, heavy with things unsaid. At length, Clara lifted the lamp again. "Actions speak louder than words, Mr. Cole. If you mean what you say, then show me." And with that, she left him in the quiet glow of the fire. The days that followed marked the beginning of Ethan's redemption. He humbled himself in ways he never had before. He asked for help from neighbors, where once his pride would have kept him silent. He admitted mistakes to his ranch hands. And most of all, he listened to Clara, to her ideas, to her guidance. No longer did he see her as an outsider. He began to treat her as an equal, a partner in all but name. The town noticed the change. "Cole's different," one man remarked at the saloon. That woman softened him. But Clara knew better. She hadn't softened him. She had made him see that strength was not in silence or solitude, but in standing shoulder to shoulder. With someone who would not falter. For Ethan Cole, redemption was not a single act or apology. It was the slow, steady recognition that he had been given a second chance, and that he must prove himself worthy of it. Autumn painted the prairie in shades of gold and rust. The air grew crisp, the nights cooler, and with the turning of the season came a quiet sense of reckoning. For Clara, it felt as though every step she had taken since arriving in Dry Creek had led to this moment. The moment where she, not Ethan, held the power to decide what her future would be. The ranch had healed along with Ethan's leg. The fences stood firm, the cattle fattened again on fresh grass, and the ranch hands, once a transient lot, stayed longer, drawn by a steadiness they attributed as much to Clara as to their employer. She had become part of the place, her hand, evident in every corner of the house, her voice woven into the rhythm of daily work. Yet she reminded herself often, she had not stayed for Ethan. She had stayed for herself. One evening. As the sun sank behind the hills, Ethan asked her to walk with him. His limp was faint now, though he leaned on a cane as they strolled the fence line. The prairie stretched wide before them, bathed in the fading light, endless and quiet. "Clara," he began, his voice low, steady but edged with vulnerability. "I've made many mistakes in my life. Sending you away was the greatest of them. I thought I knew what I wanted in a wife. I thought it had to fit some picture I carried in my mind. But I was wrong. What I needed, what I still need, is someone like you, stronger than me in ways I never understood until now." Clara stopped, folding her hands before her. Her heart pounded, but she kept her face calm. "And what is it you're asking of me, Ethan Cole?" He turned to face her fully, the sunset casting his features in gold. "I'm asking for a second chance, not because I'm lonely, not because I need help with the ranch, but because I want to share my life with you, if you'll have me." For a long moment, Clara said nothing. The weight of his words pressed against the silence. In her mind, she replayed every step of her journey, the humiliation of his rejection, the tears in that small boarding house room, the sting of gossip, the endless proving of her worth. She had survived all of it without him. She had carved her own place, earned her own respect. She did not need Ethan Cole. And yet as she looked at him now, she saw no arrogance in his eyes, no presumption. She saw humility. She saw a man who had been broken by his own pride and reshaped by hardship. She saw sincerity. Clara drew a deep breath. "You cast me aside, Ethan. You didn't see me until the town did, until I proved myself." He lowered his head. "I know. And I'll spend the rest of my days proving myself to you if you'll let me." The prairie wind stirred her skirts as she studied him. She thought of the life she might still have if she returned east. Safe, small, unremarkable. And she thought of the life she might build here, on this wild land, beside a man who had finally learned to see her as she was. At last, she reached out and took his rough, calloused hand in her own. "I'll not marry you because I have to, Ethan Cole," she said firmly, "but because I choose to, because I want to." Relief flickered in his eyes, followed by a rare smile that softened his weathered face. He squeezed her hand gently, reverently. As the sun sank and the stars began to appear, they walked back toward the ranch house together. Not as strangers bound by a letter, nor as a man and woman separated by pride, but as partners stepping into a future of their own making. Clara had been rejected, humiliated, doubted. But in proving herself, she had gained not only respect and love, but the most powerful thing of all, the freedom to choose her own destiny. And she chose Ethan Cole.